This could very well be the most important video I've ever made on Mushoku Tensei. Not because entire chapters were missing or some world building was cut, but rather because there were so many additional layers to Rudy and Roxy's development here. You see, what the anime showed was just the surface level of what Rudy and Roxy were really going through. Rudy's grief wasn't just about Paul's death, and Roxy's bold move stems from a deeper personal understanding only she could have. There are these extremely important details that make this episode about so much more. Moments I would argue are essential to defining their characters. So, as I go through how it is Roxy saved RUDEUS, I hope I can do justice to what it was both were going through at the time. Now, here's a quick reminder to check out the Mushoku Tensei inspired Mugen apparel and the giveaway I'll be doing for it on stream this Sunday. To celebrate the season finale, I'll be hosting another game show quiz testing your Mushoku Tensei anime knowledge. Anyone can participate and anyone can win so long as you answer the fastest and know your Mushoku Tensei. It's a really fun game that I like to do with my community from time to time. So, whether you want to purchase the Mugen apparel yourself or compete for a chance to win one live on stream, the link to both will be down in the description. But anyway, episode 47, Let's Go Home, covering chapters 10 to 13 from volume 12 of the light novel. I'm gonna start things off from right after the Hydra fight since it's from here that the anime sped things up a bit. What I mean is that we pretty much went from one tragedy right into the next without really highlighting how much time had passed between them. With the time it took to escape the labyrinth as well as the time it took to get back to the city, there were actually several days in which Rudy got to contemplate Paul's death. The journey itself was very sloppy, but no matter how many mistakes Rudy made along the way, not one person complained or even spoke to him. It seemed there weren't really any words that anyone wanted to say right now. It was thanks to Roxy that Rudy was even able to make it out though, since without her right behind him guiding his movements, it was very likely he would have stepped on a teleportation trap. Luckily he didn't, so aside from a few relatively intense battles, their party was able to make it out unscathed. Now, the first night back was one of the most important since the dream he had where he sees his parents introduces that additional layer of grief I mentioned at the beginning of the video. It's the first part of a much longer self-reflection we should have seen later, one that uncovers an absolutely essential piece of Rudy's character development. So, the dream was actually a memory from Rudy's past life, and it brings to light the long-forgotten question of what was the relationship with his parents like. Like, we've seen them trying to support his recovery the best way they could, but if they were truly supportive all the way to the end, then why was it that Rudy didn't go to their funeral? This was the question Rudy was contemplating himself, and it brought with it all sorts of thoughts like how did they die and what did they think about him when they died. That's right, Rudy was so isolated in the world he'd confined himself to that he didn't even know what it was that killed his parents. This made him wonder if they were perhaps ashamed or angry at him, but just like the way they died, so too were their final thoughts of him a mystery. In the end, he had no idea how they truly felt about him anymore. Perhaps he didn't even cross their mind when they died. As for how Rudy felt when it happened, well, at the time he honestly didn't feel anything. To quote his own words from the novel, he didn't love them enough to grieve their absence. He was less concerned about having lost them and more worried by the thoughts of how he was going to live now. Combine this with his fear of how people perceived this, and what you get is the core reason for why he didn't attend their funeral. You see, Rudy was afraid of the way people looked at him when they saw he wasn't sad about his parents. He was scared of the hostility and contempt he knew he'd be confronted by. So, just like how he'd done for the majority of his life, he decided to avoid it the best way he knew how. As much as Rudy knew this type of behavior wasn't acceptable, he honestly just couldn't help but act this way. Reason being that, for him, his parents dying was the equivalent of losing his last source of salvation. It was kind of like being tossed into the ocean without taking a breath first. Yes, Rudy knew that this was selfish, but when you've lived a life as dependent as his, to lose it all suddenly was more than enough to make him want to escape reality. It was simply too much for him to handle at the time. That's not me trying to make excuses for him, but is instead just how Rudy perceived it all himself. He was well aware he should have done more and tried a little bit harder. In fact, after seeing Paul's face the way it was when he died, the regret of not seeing his own parents' faces were now starting to resurface. He truly wished he could go back in time and see how it was that they looked. This was a deeply rooted trauma Rudy didn't even know he was carrying, and as you'll soon see, it ties heavily into the depraved state we see him in later. Before that though, Rudy first has to find out about Zenith. It was the day after that distressing dream with his parents, and Rudy was overcome by an intense desire to do nothing. It took all he could to get up and do something, since as much as he wanted to crawl back into bed, the urge to do anything was even stronger. So that something was watching over Zenith, and what Rudy initially felt as momentary relief quickly turned to distraught as everything who was Zenith was missing. Her memory, knowledge, and intelligence was all gone. This hit harder than you might expect, since while yes, Rudy was distant from Zenith as he mentioned last episode, there was a bit of reassurance that came from knowing he could share Paul's death with her. As the embodiment of Paul's hopes and struggles, if anyone was gonna understand the grief that Rudy was going through, Zenith would be the one to share it with. The moment Rudy realized he wouldn't be able to, that's when his heart shattered and reality collapsed. Not only was everything everyone worked towards for naught, but whatever solace Rudy thought he could find was gone now. It had instantly sent Rudy straight into the depths of despair. Days would then pass without Rudy so much as leaving his bed, and his time would be spent in an endless loop of sleeping and waking up. When asleep, he would dream the final moments right before Paul's death, then when awake he would contemplate who he was to him. As much as he wanted to get up and do something, Rudy simply didn't have the willpower to follow through on it. Instead, he just lay in bed thinking about who it was he'd just lost in his life. So, to understand more about what Rudy thought about Paul, by most standards, he was a complete failure as a father. He wasn't the best example for any child, but even so, Rudy still loved him anyway. Not the way a child usually loved a parent, but rather as someone who Rudy felt he could relate to. He was more so a partner in crime or someone on even footing with him. It's because of that he could never truly see Paul as his father, but that didn't matter since Paul saw Rudy as his child. No matter how bizarre his behavior was growing up, Paul never once thought of Rudy as anything but family. Sure, there were times when he should have acted different, but in each and every interaction he'd ever had with him, Rudy was and forever will be Paul's son. He was a true father all the way through. Whether it be by carrying burdens far too heavy for himself or by literally shielding Rudy from certain death, Paul lived his life the way that every dedicated father would. So, just like how Rudy said in the anime, he wasn't Paul's child, but Paul was most certainly still his father. Sadness bubbled as Rudy considered the true family he was leaving behind, and that led to tears which came as a shock to him. What I mean is that not once did Rudy cry when his real parents died, yet here he was not able to hold himself back. These tears were flowing naturally for someone he didn't even consider his real parent. This may have been strange in the moment, but in time it made it clear Paul was every bit apparent to Rudy as the ones from his past life. So the more Rudy thought about the person Paul was, the more he would cry until the point of exhaustion. He would then sleep and dream of those horrifying moments, then repeat the process and do it all over again. Time slipped by as Rudy lay in bed, barely doing anything. AniNews and Lilia would occasionally check up on him, but because he was so engrossed in his own distraught, they might as well have been speaking an entirely different language. Rudy's brain simply couldn't comprehend them. Even if it could, it's not like he would have replied anyway since he just didn't have words to say. Rudy would then wonder if there was a way he could have saved Paul, but that only brought with it countless regrets for not having done things differently. Like, if they had just left, planned a bit more, then came back later, surely Paul would be alive and the outcome better. Rudy knew it was far too late for that though, so instead he simply had to accept that Paul was dead. Just like his parents from his past life, he needed to understand that he'd never see them again. No matter what he did or what he said, both them and Paul were now gone forever. This brings us now to a cutscene with Roxy, since while Rudy was spending the days wallowing in grief, Roxy was actively trying to figure out a way to help him. It's the missing context explaining how she was able to make the bold step we saw in the anime. So, she was at a pub with Geese, Tallhand, and AniNews, and the four of them were trying to figure out what to do. Initially with Zenith, then with Rudy. The topic of Zenith was particularly troubling since the state she was in was tougher to accept than death. You see, whereas death was something every adventurer was always ready to accept, Zenith's condition was something worse. It was an affliction of the mind that everyone knew to be unrecoverable. Unlike physical injuries which could always be healed with magic, a broken mind couldn't be restored no matter how powerful the healing was. Not even the divine tear could help those affected by it. This made Zenith's case more of a lost cause than anything, so instead the group decided to focus on who they could help right now. Specifically Rudy and his ever-deteriorating conditions. He hadn't eaten since the day Paul died, and he was barely drinking more than the required minimum. It was a terrible state that only worsened the longer it went on for. In fact, at the rate Rudy was going, there was a good chance he would be joining Paul soon. Thus the reason why everyone had gathered to discuss it. So, the best solution was determined to have someone sleep with him, but the main problem was figuring out who. The obvious choice was of course Alinalise, but given her circumstances, she obviously couldn't. No one present knew what those circumstances were, so that's when Alinalise had to explain everything to them. It was a conversation that would finally reveal Rudy's marriage to Roxy. A significant shock that only more alcohol could help her cope with. Part of the reason she was so taken aback by it was because there was a whole lot of embarrassment that came when remembering how she acted in the labyrinth. As we all saw in the last episodes, all those advances she made now made her feel foolish. She was mortified by the thought of having done all that and upset at the fact that no one told her sooner. Roxy chose not to say anything about it though, since what mattered most now was simply helping Rudy. A predicament the others ultimately decided to let Rudy sort out himself. Since Alinalise couldn't do it and a brothel wouldn't be effective enough, in the end they all agreed Rudy would pick himself up on his own. He was after all an adult now, and more than that, he was Paul's son. So, as everyone agreed Rudy could figure it out, Roxy alone knew that he couldn't. It was a deeper understanding of Rudy that only came from the time she spent with him when she was younger. Before I talk more deeply on that though, it's important to understand why it is the others came to that conclusion so quickly. Long story short, Tallhand Geese and Alinalise were all tired. It had been 6 long years since the displacement incident, and all 3 had been working non-stop since. Whether it be traveling continent to continent or delving the labyrinth, their once broken party had reunited under a common goal again. They'd even reconciled their differences and fought side by side, which was the shining beacon in an otherwise unpleasant situation. It was a turn of events that none had ever even dreamed would happen. All that was left was to rescue Zenith and find Ghislaine, then their original party could enjoy drinks like how they used to. This was what everyone thought to be the natural outcome of this all. Now that Paul was dead though, whatever hopes each had in making that distant dream come true were now shattered and out of reach. It was a sudden tragedy that overwhelmed each of them with this indescribable feeling of exhaustion. It wasn't so much from the fact that Paul had died though, but rather from the feeling everything had been for naught. It was as if they'd spent years building something special, all for it to fall to pieces right before completing it. Kinda like spending all day on a report then losing it because you didn't save it. This was what the others were going through, and it made it clear Rudy wasn't the only one feeling the fatigue of it all. This brings us now to Roxy and RUDEUS, which on a surface level showed what it was that needed to be shown. What the anime left out that was extremely important though was the clear-cut moment indicating Rudy's grief wasn't just about Paul. It was very much associated with his original parents too. Before he straight up says how this is though, Rudy would first explain how he was repeating the same mistakes as last time. Just like how he'd been unable to give anything back to his parents before, once again he felt he'd done the same with Paul and Zenith. He'd ignored their problems and kept to himself, and only realized the true effects of it when it was far too late. That marked 50 years he'd lived in total, yet none which were spent actually growing. To him, Rudy felt he hadn't changed at all. It was a revelation that spit right in the face of everything he set out to do in this life. So, feeling as if he'd wasted his years yet again, Rudy felt recovering this time was impossible. That is, at least until Roxy came and lightened his burden a bit. Her heartbeat and smell were oddly soothing, and knowing she herself lost a friend the same way Rudy lost Paul, Well, that was reassuring since it showed it was possible to bounce back from these types of things. Roxy would then frame her advances as if they were for her, likely to make Rudy think that doing what they were going to do would be okay. She made clear that it was helping her get over Paul too, and that at most this was a casual one-time thing to wash away all the bad. This didn't really make any sense to Rudy, but for some reason he still found himself invested in it, enough that he wanted to explore more. The relief Roxy was offering was just too tempting to give up right now. It's the day after that brings us to what I think is the most important part of this whole season, because the topics covered here add a whole nother layer we've completely forgotten about Rudy. The anime did it back when he was dealing with Norn, but removed it here now in this scene with Roxy. It's the final part showing Rudy come to terms with how he treated his old family, an essential part of him accepting who he was before and finally moving on so that he can focus on his new family. So, the day after, Rudy did still feel an overbearing heaviness, but it wasn't the same despair he'd felt before. No, the anguish of yesterday felt like nothing but a dream now. He certainly felt lighter what with experiencing what he did, but to say it fixed everything wouldn't be accurate. It was more so just an effective means of temporary alleviation. What worked to help him more than that was actually Roxy's response to his question of what he should do now. It was an important question prefaced by an even more important story, one we unfortunately didn't get to see in the anime. So, before Rudy had asked what he did, he first spoke of his past life under the pretext it was a story he just made up. He referenced his trauma, the ensuing seclusion, and everything after, focusing mostly on the parts with his parents. You see, he wanted to make clear the part where he wasted away his old life, so the pain of repeating that same mistake was apparent in this new one. He explained how his old parents died and he didn't see them off, then paralleled that to Paul's death and how it made him see things differently. What I mean is that it was only after losing someone precious in this new life that Rudy was finally able to recall the death of his old parents and finally mourn them. A story Rudy gave to Roxy without including himself, but the message was clear and this was how Rudy was truly feeling. He was finally coming to terms with how it was he left his family in his old life and seeing for the first time just how much it really weighed on him. As Rudy described it himself, it was like the pent-up bile festering in his heart was all spilling out now. An emotional burden he was dying to finally let out to someone. So, all this was never just about Paul, but instead about his original parents too. It was an additional layer that makes the context of his question entirely different. Rather than what he should do as someone grieving Paul, it's now what should he do as someone who never reconciled with his old parents. This was what Rudy was truly asking here. It made Roxy's response slightly different, since at first she suggested visiting his parents' graves and seeing the family that kicked him out. When Rudy explained how that wasn't possible, that's when she said how he should cherish the family in front of him now. It was an incredibly cliché response for sure, yet one strong enough to relieve Rudy of everything. Hearing her say these basic yet meaningful words reminded Rudy that both his parents and Paul's deaths were inevitable. It allowed him to understand that all he could do was face them head on and accept them. The bare minimum as someone still living. Yes, he did feel anxious about having to relay Paul's death to his sisters, but that was just one of many anxieties in a future full of unknowns. A future Rudy knew he couldn't run away from. If he was gonna keep pushing forward like how Paul would have wanted him to, then the only thing he could do now was solve the problems in front of him. He didn't know what he should do or how exactly to proceed, but what he could do was approach each issue and work his best to solve them. This was what he'd decided to do when he was reborn here, and it's once again something he'd recommitted to doing now. He had reaffirmed with himself his principle of living life to the fullest. This meant he would no longer turn his eyes away, so no matter what the problem, he vowed to always overcome them. It was a renewed mindset that freed Rudy from the shackles previously restraining him. A beacon of light shone in the darkness by Roxy. Because she was able to help him see what was really important, not only was Rudy able to deal with Paul's death in a way that was healthy, but he was also able to finally accept and overcome this suppressed emotional burden from his past life. It's some extra depth to Rudy's character that I personally thought to be very important. Now, The rest of the episode was the journey home, but rather than talk about the crazy money they made or Rudy's soft spot for Armadillo, instead I just want to talk briefly on Roxy's perspective here. Almost a month had passed where she was acting as both Rudy's left hand and his lover, so Rudy was trying to figure out a way to make things right. He wanted to repay Roxy for saving him since the way she had was on par with the way that Sylphie did. She was a source of mental support unlike any that Rudy had ever had before. Even if you consider all the things she had done before all this, Roxy's role in his life has had an immeasurable impact on him. Enough that Rudy knew he owed her more than anyone. So, Roxy would take this chance to explain her side of things, and specifically how she knew Rudy wouldn't be able to recover on his own. You see, she remembered just how close Rudy was to Paul back then. She also remembered just how terrified Rudy was when he went outside, and this reminded Roxy that despite all of Rudy's talent, deep down he was actually really weak. She recognized a part of Rudy that no one else ever could and used it to understand that Paul meant far more to him than anyone had even realized. Perhaps more than even Rudy himself. So, now that Paul was gone, Roxy was afraid Rudy would sink so far into depression that he wouldn't recover. She was afraid that leaving him for too long would only make things worse. This led her to actively try and find a solution, but since no one else could provide the one that she knew would work, Roxy concluded that it had to be her. She came to realize that she was the only one who could do this. The reason why she got so emotional after this was because in that brief moment where she shared such a deep intimacy with Rudy, she couldn't help but think that maybe she did have a chance. As illogical as it was to think that, Roxy's feelings for Rudy were something she simply couldn't contain anymore. What made the whole thing especially heart-wrenching was the fact that everyone knew Roxy had feelings for Rudy, yet no one did anything to tell her her efforts were futile. No. Instead, everyone just let them build and build to the point that she couldn't suppress them anymore, only for them to end up shattered in a conversation which should have happened sooner. To Roxy, this was both cruel and unfair, and while she would never voice how she felt to any of the others, in truth she was deeply hurt by how it happened. It was a devastating heartbreak that Rudy couldn't help but feel partially responsible for. The rest was the journey to the ruins, then the forest after, which for the most part captured the main things just fine. There was one big bombshell I'm surprised they didn't include, but that's something I'm sure they'll mention either next episode or next season. Just in case they don't though, I'll give you 5 seconds to click off the video, then I'll just go ahead and say what it was that was said. Okay, so in this conversation with Alina Lise, part of the reason both her and Rudy had such a change of heart was the potential that Roxy was, well, pregnant. Details had come out during a conversation between just Alina Lise and Roxy, and Alina Lise was now sharing those details with Rudy. This was what prompted Rudy to say he'd marry Roxy, and that's what led to their conversation after. But yeah, that's the crucial bits you missed from an extremely drama-filled episode. It's unfortunate the anime couldn't include all the extra layers adding to Rudy and Roxy's characters, but at least that meant I was able to make what I hope was a decent video for it. If there was any video I'd want a Mushoku Tensei fan to watch, it'd probably be this one since I feel a lot needed to be said about this episode. So, if you enjoyed what you saw, then feel free to leave a like and let me know down in the comments. Now, don't forget to check out the Tensura and Mushoku Tensei inspired Mugen apparel and come compete to win one with my quiz today. It'll be some fun and friendly competition, and if you're watching this the day it came out, then I should be live in just a few hours. The New Beginnings collection will also be gone after a week, so if you haven't had the chance to get your Goddess tees or the New Beginnings one, be sure to check those out too before it's too late. But anyway, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time, ciao!